It's early in the morning here. I'm just ready to go scuba diving, but let's recap what's happening. So day after Liberation Day, Trump announced sweeping tariffs against the whole world. Let's just look at the pre-market. Okay, the Dow futures are down 1,250 just before the market opens. The S&P futures are down 207, and the NASDAQ futures are down 849. I don't think I've ever seen them down 849, over 4%. Well, that's positive. And they're down so much because I guess investors are anticipating the colossal mess and self-inflicted wound that the U.S. is going to be dealing with here. Let's look at this list. And these are the tariffs that the U.S. administration announced yesterday. Now, look at this. China, 34% is the new tariff on top of what was there before. So it's over 50. It's like 54%. The share of U.S. imports, China, is 13.4%. So 13.4% of U.S. imports come from China. An additional 34% tariffs on those. An additional 20% tariffs on Europe. 46% on Vietnam. An additional 32% on Taiwan. An additional 24% on Japan. And we're going to stop there, but you can see that the list is, it's the whole world basically. But those top countries represent kind of the biggest chunk. And even though something like Taiwan represents only 3.6% of U.S. imports, it's all the same thing. It's chips. And I'm not talking about the potato kind, right? I'm talking about chips that are in your computer, your cars, electronic chip-making powerhouse Taiwan. And then there's a column here that talks about the trade balance. And you can see that pretty much all the numbers are negative. Like China, minus 292 billion, EU, minus 241 billion. What are those numbers? I'm going to explain that. Basically, what that number means is that the U.S. imports more from that country than that country imports from the U.S. And this is kind of, you have to be careful when you say these things because people that aren't informed become more misinformed. Now, when you say the U.S. imports more from China than China imports from the U.S., it's not actually the U.S. It's not the U.S. government versus the Chinese government. It means that companies import products from China, which Americans buy, right? And American companies import $292 billion more from China than Chinese companies import from the U.S. I'm going to explain why that's the case, why all of these numbers are negative. Guys, I speak directly to Americans now. Everything in your country is going to cost more, okay? Like, look at just the top four there. Everything you buy. I've been to the U.S. You go to the store, you go to Costco, anything that you buy, almost everything comes from China. It's all going to cost more, 34% more. Chips from Taiwan, every bit of electronics, 24% on Japan, so cars, TVs, all your electronics, all your computers. Basically everything that you buy in the United States is going to cost more by these percentages, pretty much by the percentages that you see there. And it's not going to affect me. I'm Canadian. I live in Canada. So when I buy a computer, or I buy a TV and it's made in Japan, it's not going to cost me 24% more. And Japan's not going to pay the United States 24% extra for each TV they sell. It's the U.S. Costco, when they buy a load of TVs from Japan, when they cross the border into the United States, they will be subject to a tariff of 24%. The cost will go up. I don't think the Americans understand it. They just don't understand it. It's going to cost you, your cost of living is going to skyrocket now, unless there's backtracking on these numbers or they're going to start carving out special exemptions, or they're just going to panic and reverse these, right? Jumps in prices like you've never seen. Like, what is this? I look down here, Colombia, 49% new tariff. Does that mean that your coffee is going to cost more? Go to when do these kick in? I'm not even sure what days these kick in, but after these kick in, go to Starbucks. Well, maybe you'll have to wait a couple of weeks because they probably have a bunch of coffee already, in their inventory. But when they have to buy more, beans, they're going to be subject to a 49% tariff. It's going to cost you more to have your coffee in the morning. This is bizarre, and the market is down very, very sharply. And it's going to be interesting to see how it shakes up. But let me talk to you a little bit, if you're still watching, if you're a Republican or a conservative, and you want to learn maybe a little bit why these numbers are negative and why this is such a horrible idea. Just let me explain it a little bit here. Why are all these numbers, this trade balance numbers, all negative? If you asked your president, he would say something like, with respect to Canada, he would say, Canada's been very unfair to us. They're very nasty. You know, they're really terrible people. We're really going to have to do something about those Canadians. They're very unfair. They've been very unfair to us. We've subsidized them for $200 billion a year. And why should we subsidize them for $200 billion a year? We're going to put tariffs on them and we're going to get that money back. That's what your president would tell you about Canada. And then, weirdly, the media and reporters would take that sentence, which is just a long string of nonsense and misinformation, like from the first word to the end word, complete nonsense, and then they'll try and start explaining it. They'll say, they'll skip the part about Canada being nasty and they're being very unfair and stuff, because they'll say, oh, that's just Trump, that's the way he talks. And then they'll zero in on the last bit of nonsense that he spewed, where he says, why should the U.S. subsidize Canada for $200 billion? Which is complete and utter nonsense, because the U.S. does not subsidize Canada at all. You want me to tell you what a subsidy is? A subsidy is, if you live in the U.S., when you go to the car dealer, I don't know if this is still the case, but when you went to the car dealer last year to buy a Tesla, and the cost of the Tesla was 80 grand, and then the dealer told you, oh, well, there's a $10,000 rebate because the government's trying to encourage people to buy electric cars. If you buy this, you get a $10,000 subsidy. That's a subsidy. When the government usually gives you money to encourage you to do something. So subsidies on EV sales, rebates at the dealer, that's a subsidy. A negative number like a trade balance is not a subsidy. So then they'll try and explain what he meant by saying the U.S. subsidizes Canada by $200 billion, and they'll say, well, maybe he's referring to the trade balance, which some people refer to surpluses or deficits, and the U.S. has had a trade deficit with Canada of about $50 billion, but Trump exaggerates a bit, so maybe he's saying $200 billion, or maybe he's including in some other special numbers that we mere mortals don't completely understand. And they'll try and justify a comment that's complete nonsense. So let me explain to you why referring to these negative numbers here as subsidies, or as in some way being a plot against the United States, is just nonsense. And you can describe why these numbers are negative very simply. Because let me ask you a question. If you're American, which is the richest country in the world? The United States. And because the United States is the richest country in the world, the population is fairly well off. And so let me ask you another question now. Who are the biggest consumers in the world? Who has the most disposable income, and what households, what people buy the most in the world? Well, let me show you. Here's a list of countries ranked by household expenditure per capita, using an average currency in the world to normalize the currency. And you can see on top of the list is the United States. Average household consumes $43,931. And it gives you the year that the numbers were last calculated. So as of 2022, basically. The US by far has the biggest consumers in the world because they have the most money. And you can see that every other country in the world is the number slightly lower. And if we go, for example, to China, let's find China on this list, okay? Let's keep going. What is the average household consumption in China? I'm going to scroll down here. Chile. Where is China? Let's stop at Mexico. Mexico, average household consumption is 11,000. It's a much poorer country than the United States. Let's use Mexico and Canada, okay? Mexico here has and I don't know these numbers, we're going to look at them here together, live. So Mexico household consumption is 11,000. Canada is a fairly affluent country, so we're going to be up closer to the top of the list. Where are we? Come on, Canada. It's early in the morning, guys. Okay, here we are. Canada, 26,000 per household. So we're a fairly affluent country. Now, what's the trade balance between the United States and Canada and the United States and Mexico? And I'm going to guess that Canada has a trade imbalance with the U.S. that would be a negative number for the U.S., a small one, and Mexico is going to have a bigger one. So let's check those numbers. So you just Google this, okay, guys? U.S.-Mexico trade balance, trading economics. In 2024, the U.S. goods trade deficit with Mexico reached 171 billion. Total trade is about 839 billion. The U.S. exports to Mexico 330 billion, and the Mexico exports to the U.S. 505 billion. So Mexico sells more to the U.S. than the U.S. sells to Mexico. Why? Because, like, for example, the U.S. eats more avocados than Mexicans, right? On the Super Bowl weekend, the U.S. consumes more avocados than the whole Mexican country does probably in 6 months, because Americans are twice as big and they consume more. That's a little bit of comedy, but basically because the U.S. has much higher consumption. They need more stuff, and the Mexicans are poor. They don't consume very much, so they don't need as much stuff. So the trade imbalance, and I know this website here calls it a deficit, the trade imbalance is $171 billion. Meaning Mexico sells 171 billion more to the U.S. than it buys from the U.S. And your president would tell you, well, the Mexicans are very unfair. We're subsidizing them, and he'll exaggerate this number. We're subsidizing them by $500 million a year. It's just nonsense. Now let's check Canada. I'm going to put Canada in here, and I'm going to guess that trade imbalance is going to be a smaller number than 171 billion. Let's just do it live here. Okay. There you go. In 2024, the U.S. goods trades deficit with Canada was $63 billion. So it's a smaller number, $63 billion, because Canada's more affluent and Canada buys more. Canada also has a much smaller population than the U.S. We only have 40 million people, and the U.S. has about 400 million people, right? So it's amazing that our trade imbalance is so close, because how would 40 million people import so much? It's because Canada imports most of its imports from the United States, because we're so close. But let's try and find a country that's about the size of the U.S. Okay, world population, and let's look. Okay, India is the biggest country, then China, then the United States. Okay, the country that's about the closest in population to the United States is Indonesia. If we go back to this list, where's Indonesia? Now, Indonesia is going to be down there. Indonesia is not a very wealthy country. They have approximately the same number of people, plus or minus 50 million, I guess. There it is. There's Indonesia right here. Indonesia's consumption, household consumption, is 6,395 per household. They're poor. They don't consume a lot, okay? 6,300 or so compared to the United States, 43,900. Now, why is that? Because the U.S. is wealthier. The average U.S. household maybe has 5 flat-screen TVs in it, right? You go to average Indonesian household, maybe they don't have a TV. Maybe they can only afford an old used one. They consume less. All right? So let's look at the trade imbalance between those two countries. And let's type in Thailand. Trade imbalance, Thailand, and we'll look at the thing here. Okay, in 2024, U.S. goods trade deficit with Thailand was 45 billion. Well, there you go. Of course it's a trade deficit. What do you expect? The U.S. consumes way more, and it's a 45 billion trade deficit. The U.S. goods imported from Thailand are 63 billion, and Thailand buys 45 billion less than that. So there's not very much trade between Thailand and the U.S., but it's completely lopsided. Why? Because Thailand has something that the U.S. wants to buy, and I'm not the U.S. U.S. consumers, U.S. companies want to import something from Thailand that they want to sell to U.S. consumers, and Thailand can't really afford to buy much from the US because they're poor. Does it start to make that's what a trade imbalance is all about. The more affluent the country is, usually the bigger the trade imbalance is with countries that are less affluent, because less affluent countries consume less, so importers and companies in that country they don't buy as much stuff because they can't sell it to their citizens because they don't have any money, because they're poor. So is this starting to make sense to you guys? Is it starting to make sense? Let's find Thailand here again, and use that, because maybe for some people it just doesn't make sense. Thailand, is so much poorer than the United States. Let me use an example. Thailand and the United States have about the same amount of people, right? Let's make it simple and say that the only thing that people trade in the world is cookies, all right? Just cookies. That's the only thing that exists in the world. So in a world where there's just cookies, the U.S. consumes a lot more. They have more consumption. They eat more cookies. Americans eat 10 times as many cookies as the people from Thailand. The Americans are bigger and they consume more. So there's about the same amount of people. Which country is going to need more cookies? The Americans, right? But they're both big countries. They both have lots of people that are baking cookies. The people in Thailand can bake just as many as the people in the U.S., but they don't eat as much. They eat 1 cookie a day. But the Americans eat 10 cookies a day because they're big fat consumers, right? They're the richest cookie-eating country in the world. So what do you think is going to happen? The people in Thailand are going to bake these cookies, and the Americans can't bake 10 cookies each because that's so many cookies. They eat so much. They're like, we need more cookies. We've got to trade with other countries. Where can we get more cookies? We'll buy them from Thailand because those guys, they only eat 1 a day, and we eat 10 a day. We need to import more cookies. So they trade. What's the big deal? So why is that a problem? Like, go on a diet if you don't want to have a trade imbalance. Eat less. The main reason there's trade imbalances in the world is because of the consumption rates. And the U.S. consumes the most. You're on top of the list. Look, you are the biggest household expenditures per capita. You're the biggest consumers in the world. You demand more products. Your companies in your country trade with other countries, and they buy more stuff to sell to you, okay? Because you're the biggest consumers. You should be happy. You're the richest. That's why the numbers are like this, right? Because you want 4 TVs per house. You want 2 big SUVs parked out, one for your wife and one for you, right? And maybe a separate car to go camping with. In Mexico, they don't have 2 big SUVs and a camper trailer parked. They have a 14-year-old hand-me-down Ford that they fixed themselves because they're poor. Are you starting to follow? The reason there's these trade imbalances, and let me speak just a second here, because politicians, it used to be that economists would refer to these numbers as the trade imbalance between countries. There's a balance of trade, and it was discussed rationally. But then politicians started to try and weaponize these, it's a trade deficit. It's a deficit. You owe us, and trying to convince people that this is like some evil thing. And so now politicians kind of talk about this as a trade surplus or trade deficit. It's not a deficit. You're not in debt. It just means you consume more, so companies from your country import more, so you can buy it. And does it follow? Did my explanation make sense? So in general, I think the U.S. now, for whatever reason, some weirdly concocted reason, or I'm not sure even if the president understands this, or if there's other people that are kind of setting this agenda. Let me kind of put it to you in a simple way, is that I think they believe that the world is a pie. There's one pie, and the U.S. wants a bigger slice of that pie. They want a bigger slice of that wealth. They want to move higher up on this list, I guess, is the way they're looking at it. And there's only winners and there's only losers. And we have a deficit with everyone, trade imbalance. So in order for us to win, we need a bigger slice of that pie. And we want more and everyone should have less, I think, is the way they're looking at it. But really, the way the world has worked over the past decades since World War II is with trading, the pie's not the same size. The pie keeps getting bigger. And if the world works together and everyone on this list gets wealthier and their consumption rates get higher, then the pie gets bigger, right? So having the same proportion of the pie, having the biggest proportion and being at the top of a bigger pie, you get wealthier faster if the pie is growing, rather than shrinking the pie by having an economic war with everyone and trying to get a bigger piece for yourself. It's crazy, but that's what's happening. So consider yourself liberated, Americans. You are liberated, and you will pay more now for everything. What's going to happen is the U.S. administration now is going to try and shrink these trade balance numbers, right? The trade deficit, they call it, because they're mostly negative. They're going to shrink those numbers by charging tariffs to all imports, which Americans are going to pay. So Americans are going to get poorer, and Americans are going to start consuming less and buying less from other countries, and these numbers are going to get less negative. And so what you're in fact doing is, rather than getting richer and taking a piece of a bigger pie, you're going to shrink the pie, and you're going to get poorer because you'll be able to consume less because of these massive tariffs on everything that you're going to buy. And so Americans are going to get poorer, and then things will be balanced, I guess. Then you'll say, well, we have a trade surplus now. Do you want to be like Mexico? Do you want to sell more to other countries so they can consume more and be affluent? It's completely backwards. This is the biggest self-inflicted catastrophe that the U.S. has ever inflicted on itself. And I can't help but kind of laughing, because it's going to play out. It's going to be a shit show for you guys in the U.S. You're going to pay more for everything. You're going to be poorer, so then you won't be able to afford as much, which means that your companies are going to import less because you guys won't be able to afford as much. You may go into a recession, and after all that, these numbers will be less negative. And so your president will tell you, well, you see, it worked. We have a trade surplus now. Well, that's not a good thing. You want to have a trade deficit. You want to be the richest. You want to consume the most. It's backwards. So anyways, hopefully my explanation made a little bit of sense. If you're still watching, if you're a conservative or Republican and still watching, congratulations. Because they won't believe a word of what I said. But if you want to know a little bit more about how tariffs work, I'll put it in the top right corner here. I did a video explaining rationally, without humor, exactly how tariffs work. And I explain how these numbers, all these percentages, are all a tax on the import of goods by U.S. companies from other countries that will be immediately passed on to the consumers. They're a large proportion. They'll try and drop the price a little bit. The U.S. government will collect this money as the products enter the country, and they'll pass these costs on to the consumers. And you guys in the U.S., look out. Over the next couple of months, unless they backtrack on this, you're going to be paying a lot more for everything. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.